Hello.
Hello.
Right, so we're here for episode 5 of the Antiracism Book Club with Gyles and Vanetta Morrison.
Hi all.
Hello there. So let's get straight to it then. We've got 3 chapters to cover today. We're looking at chapters 13, 14 and 15 of the of How to Be an Anti-Racist by Professor Ibram X Kendi.
Yeah.
And the first chapter then, chapter 13, is looking at space. So if you just look at these in more detail, the main points that we want to raise is around space racism, integrationist strategies, and anti-racist strategies.
Yeah.
And as you know from listening to previous episodes, we're very much into our definitions. So the first definition then is space racism. So space racism is a powerful collection of racist policies that lead to resource inequity between racialized spaces, or the elimination of certain racialized spaces, which are substantiated by racist ideas about racialized spaces. So what would probably make kind of a lot of sense would be that space anti-racism is kind of the opposite. It's a powerful collection of anti-racist policies that lead to racial equity between integrated and protected racialized spaces, which are substantiated by anti-racist ideas about racialized spaces. So yeah, there's a bit of a mouthful.
Yeah,
Professor Kendi, he does like to have his long definitions, doesn't he?
Yeah, and it does seem like a bit of a mouthful, but actually when you go through the chapter, it is quite clear and evident what he's talking about. And so just to make it very clear, a space is racialized when one racial group is known to either govern that space or make up the clear majority in the space. So you would have things like Chinatown in London, or even in New York, wherever you're at, you might have spaces that are set for a specific racial group. And that's what we're talking about when we're saying a space is racialized. And so some of the points that are made in this chapter is the fact that people and spaces are racialized by racist powers. And so what Professor Kendi really means by that is the fact that actually we've already explored the fact that there is no biological grounds for different races. We are the one race, we're the human race.
Yeah.
There are no biological grounds for racism. Racism is a social, political, economical construct. And people are racialized based on the powers that be needing them to be racialized so that there are hierarchies in people. And that's the same for hierarchies in spaces. So he talks about the fact that, you know, the ghetto, places that we know as ghettos in our cities or countries, places that we know as inner cities, or even on a continental level, third world countries, these are spaces that have been racialized by racist powers. And we need to think about this when we are discussing space and resources within space, because we think about, you know, when we hear the term third world, we immediately think about what? Africa.
Yeah.
We think about maybe some parts of South Asia. We maybe think about, you know, some parts of Latin America. But really and truly, the reason why these places have been classed third world countries is to once again create a hierarchy between the worlds, and also these actually have been made to a certain extent. They have been made third world countries by those countries that see themselves as first world countries. Yeah. So again, there's a lot of racializing and a lot of power plays within how we label even spaces.
So just looking into that a little more, we have a few points that we want to raise here. So the first one being obviously that people and spaces are racialized by racist powers, we've said. This could be a ghetto in a city, the third world. It doesn't really matter. It's that there is people who have a particular status in society who are going to define why a particular space is associated with race. And for an anti-racist, there is no one real world, but just many. You know, it's just life for different people, different cultures, based on the environments that they're in. And actually, we shouldn't be having racist policies that cause those differences. It should just be cultural differences.
Yes.
So it's not fair to compare spaces based on different race classes, e.g. the rich white versus the poor black. Yeah,
so we often might see in newspaper articles or research articles about, oh, well, poor black neighborhoods have X what might more than the average white neighborhood, but the average white neighborhood might have a completely different socioeconomic status. So it's not fair to compare these different race classes, which we learned about in the last episode, to the actual racialized spaces, because it is always a matter of resources, how many resources people have access to, and how many resources people are willing to put into a certain space or take away from a certain space as well. So we talk about, you know, gentrification and its knock-on effect on how space is developed. And I know that you've got examples of how London, there are parts of London that are
dramatically changed. So I was born and raised in Tower Hamlets in East London. And I still remember when I was at medical school going to Shoreditch, going to certain parts of Bethnal Green, leading up towards Dalston, into Hackney, which is kind of a racialized space. You will see that as you go from Bethnal Green up into Dalston, into Hackney, it's very much considered an Afro-Caribbean community there, particularly that of Jamaican descent. And then quickly over the years, there's been serious gentrification. They introduced an additional train station, which brought in more transport, better transport. There's been more housing into that area. There's been more office blocks. It's brought in a lot more wealth. As white people have then moved in, who are bringing the wealth, and obviously some black people and other races, but predominantly white people, that has then led for there to be a huge shift in the tone and the atmosphere of the environment, to actually know how you can even thrive there as someone historically black who's been there for, you know, half a century. Life has dramatically changed. You know, I still recall even areas in still in Tower Hamlets, where I was born and raised, as I mentioned, in Docklands, used to be a lot of gangs. As soon as houses were being built, more offices were there. The actual families of those gang members that they belonged to couldn't physically live there anymore. So they got moved out. And so gentrification is seen as, you know, a great way to bring wealth to areas, but at what cost? You know, there's a lot of movement of people because actually the reason why they're moving isn't necessarily because they're poor, but because of policies that are in place, which has dictated the environment that they're in. And as we'll talk a bit more later on in this episode, had there been better resources being provided, not as simple as let's build some houses, let's build some office blocks, there could have been a means to develop the people in that area rather than replacing the people that were living there.
That's it. And so there's one quote that we want to go into. When people contend that black spaces do not represent reality, they are speaking from the white worldview of black people in the minority. They are conceptualizing the real American world as white. To be anti-racist is to recognize there is no such thing as the real world, only real worlds, multiple worldviews. And that leads us to the next kind of under point in chapter 13, which has to do with integrationist strategy. So these are different ways in which spaces are being utilized and used, that Professor Kendi explains. And so the integrationist strategy really is about placing every person, every white and non-white person, into the same space. And the idea is that this should ensure that it will civilize the non-whites and make whites anti-racist. So it will tackle the racism of majority white people, and at the same time, it will raise the standard of civilization of majority non-white people. But as you can tell straight away, if you've been with us on this journey, you know this is racist. This is racist, you know? So as much as on the outside, it seems like, of course, everybody should come together. That's what anti-racism is about. The actual ethos and undertone of integrationist strategies is for the sake of bringing everyone together so that the black person who is uncivilized can be in the same space as the white person who is racist, and they should be kind of almost canceling each other out in a way, as in terms of canceling each other's ideologies, false ideologies out. The problem with this is that in the majority of the world, these integrationist strategies still have to do with the fact that they are dominated by white power and white culture. So there's no way they can be objective. There is no way these spaces can be objective, because black people are still considered as inferior in these spaces. So again, I love, there's another quote that we have that we'll get into, because Professor Kendi actually puts it into statistical numbers of the logical conclusion of what an integrationist strategy would look like.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to?
So through lynching Black bodies, segregationists are, in the end, more harmful to Black bodies than integrationists are. Through lynching Black cultures, integrationists are, in the end, more harmful to Black bodies than segregationists are.
And so this is so powerful, but it continues.
Think about the logical conclusion of every integrationist strategy. Every race being represented in every US space according to their percentage in the national population. So a Black, which is 12.7% person, would not see another until after seeing 8 or so non-Blacks.
So this is the conclusion of an integrationist strategy. Based on your percentage in the population, just mix, just mingle. But this leads to the fact that actually, like Professor Kendi said, a Black person would have to be surrounded by 8 non-Black people before they see another Black person.
Mm-hmm.
And it becomes crazy. I think an Asian person at some point has to see 36 non-Asian people before they then come to see another Asian person. So that means even family members are too close for the integrationist strategy to work. It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
It just doesn't make any sense. And of course, we know Professor Kendi offers an anti-racist strategy to this, which sounds different.
Let's look into that then. So anti-racist strategies here is there's a desire to separate from racists and racism. And it should be we should be voluntarily creating spaces of solidarity. Like, it shouldn't be trying to force people to come together. It should be something that is natural.
Mm-hmm.
So, this does contrast to some extent with, for example, the migration of people to the UK, which I'm familiar with, having come to the UK. Yes, London in particular as a city, the national city, it is a melting pot of cultures. But you still get much more of that integrationist view. As much as cultures are represented, actually, there is a lot of racism still there. There is still a lot of times where, you have to try and conform to how things are done the British way, whatever that means, to thrive. And that's not an anti-racist way of doing things at all,
Yeah.
And so as we continue to see here, there's not spaces, there should be no spaces of white hate at all. There should be open and equal access to all public spaces. Everybody is just part of the world, should be free to travel wherever they want to.
And it finally leads to the fact that actually an anti-racist strategy on space is one that includes desegregation, integration to a certain extent, and racial solidarity. And we'll go through these themes a little bit further now. So desegregation has to do with eliminating all barriers to all racialized spaces. To be anti-racist is to support the voluntary integration of bodies attracted by cultural difference, a shared humanity. So that means that, yes, we're not saying, this school only white students can attend, this school only Black students can attend, because then ultimately you'll have segregation again. It will be the Jim Crow season again. But this is so he's saying we're eliminating all barriers to all racialized spaces. We need to ensure there's a voluntary integration of people who are attracted by difference and a shared humanity. Including into that is then integration of resources rather than bodies. So to be an anti-racist is to champion resource equity by challenging the racist policies that produce resource inequity. So we don't really, I don't see us having much of that in the UK or even in Europe in general, but in America, there's a well-known group of universities known as HBCUs, historically Black universities, historically Black colleges and universities. And so these are ones that aren't necessarily integrated because they are historically Black. It doesn't mean that they won't allow white people to be part of those universities, but from their perspective, actually, because of the conflict and tensions history, and because of the fact that actually at some point Black people weren't being admitted into white universities, so they had to create their own spaces, they had to create their own things so that they could continue educating themselves. So now we have these historically Black universities, but people are saying, well, it's not like people aren't allowed to go to white universities anymore, so why don't you just integrate? Why do you have to have your own part? And then they do research that then figures out that actually maybe some of the historically Black universities don't bring about as much of an academic progress to Black people as Black people going to white universities. But again, we need to look at what does the research actually saying and who has done this research? Because it can potentially be quite prejudiced. And if you look at the resources, the problem is that even the most funded historically Black university, which Professor Kendi said is Howard University, the most funded historically Black university has 36 times less funding than some of the Stanfords or Yales that we know about. So it's looking at actually how, if we were to change the resources people have, how would those universities perform? Because research has already shown that actually Black people going to those universities mentally are flourishing and doing much better than Black people going to Stanford, Black people going to Yale, Black people going to Princeton, just because there is still racism in those universities, you know? And of course, we're not saying that there isn't necessarily prejudice in the Black universities, but there's a difference when your lecturers aren't looking at you like they expect you to fail just because of the color of your skin. And that's what often people encounter in historically white universities, because there's a legacy of prejudice that hasn't necessarily been completely confronted and tackled.
So this third area then is looking at racial solidarity. So racial solidarity is about openly identifying, supporting, and protecting integrated racial spaces. To be anti-racist is to equate and nurture difference among racial groups. And it's very simple, you know. There is a beauty that comes from the different cultures that we have in the world. Just looking at food, you know, Vanetta and I, we're big time foodies. And the food that you would get just within one country can be so incredibly diverse. Like, my family is from the Caribbean, my mother from Jamaica, my father from Antigua. Jamaican national dish of the country, of the island, is ackee saltfish. There's also curry goat, there's escovitch fish, you know, there's dumplings, there's plantain. Plantain isn't just from Jamaica, you find that across the Caribbean, across even Latin America, you'll find it definitely across Africa. But then when you go to just one country in Africa, let's pick Nigeria, say, they've got jollof rice, but there's a version of jollof rice that you would find in all the neighboring countries in West Africa. And so just the food, just what would be seen as Black food, which is still very, very, you know, racist view of saying Black food, you know, there's so much diversity that will come from the different countries. Haven't gone to Europe yet, haven't gone to any part of Asia, you know, in talking about the food. There's so much wealth that we have as a species, as the human race. When we look at the fact that there is so many differences, until we start recognizing that those differences need to be celebrated, until that is the crux of what it means to live, you know, that we want to celebrate these differences, we're not going to have much chance of being successfully anti-racist. So I really like how that was seen as the last part for Professor Kendi. Is that with these racialized spaces, to be anti-racist, you need to have the racial solidarity. You need to recognize there's these differences and celebrate them, actually provide opportunity for people to thrive and actually live that life that they identify with culture. So moving on then to chapter 14.
So chapter 14 is all about gender. And so both chapter 14 and 15 are much shorter than previous chapters, but actually they still pack quite a bit of a punch.
Big time.
And so, so chapter 14, there's more information in that chapter with regards to broken Black family and that whole concept of the matriarch. We also look at Black racism. And then finally, we also define gender racism and its implications. We're starting off with the definition of gender racism, but we're actually ending the chapter with the consequences of gender racism. Yeah. So looking at the definitions then.
So gender racism is a powerful collection of racist policies that lead to inequity between race genders and are substantiated by racist ideas about race genders. And to be clear, a race gender is a racialized gender. So it's not just that you are black, it's not just that you're female, you are a black female. So then to be gender anti-racist is looking at having a collection of anti-racist policies that lead to equity between race genders and are substantiated by anti-racist ideas about race genders.
Yeah. So looking at some of the discussion points then, so as we said, the chapter starts with the concept of broken Black families. And initially, the research that was done with regards to why there was such a rise in single parent households in America, that research initially blamed Black women. And it victimized Black men because it was basically saying that, oh, the Black woman has become too dominant and has emasculated the Black man. And the Black man is being faced by emasculation at home and discrimination when he leaves the home. And this has led to an increase in single parent households. But again, Professor Kendi has taught us this, and this is something that we're learning, that whenever you see patterns of a result, patterns of behavior, it shouldn't be seen as part of someone's character trait. You should always research what are the policies underlying those patterns of behavior. So fair enough that the research showed more single parent households. That's fair enough. That's a fact. That's a reality, you know, but it's the why there are more single parent households that you really need to be sensitive to and attuned to. And you can't just say, well, it's because Black women are emasculating Black men and Black men are facing emasculation and discrimination in the workplace. You need to do that research. You can't just base it on what you assume.
That is the underlying reason of true scientific research.
Exactly.
Is that when you found a finding, don't just try and explain it based on your best understanding. Actually do the research to find out why. You know, because for sure, racial bias, as in actual researchers being racist, has led to a lot of these conclusions being drawn. Absolutely. They're not actually necessarily doing the research for the benefit of Black people. It's still, if they're racist themselves, being done as a means to reinforce the racist idea that being white is superior. So, you know, as Vanetta said, doing that research is crucially important. And tell you now, Professor Kendi's certainly done his research.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, so this moving on is that policing the sexuality of Black women and men. You just want to talk on that topic?
Yeah. So what then came out of this research? So this research was actually done by President Johnson's one cabinet member of President Johnson. I don't quite remember who it was anymore, but he did this research, and this then led to the fact that actually Black men and Black women, their sexuality was being called into question. They were said that they were hypersexual, and this is a problem that needs to be resolved. And it actually led to 700,000 involuntary sterilizations of Black women in 1980. 1980.
Yes, it's not that long ago.
That's not that long ago.
It's long past civil rights movement.
That's not that long ago. It's literally 40 years.
Yeah, just to reiterate, we're talking about someone has been forced to not have children involuntarily. Like they didn't have any choice on the matter. 700,000 women.
And that's just in the United States.
Yeah.
Because of research suggesting that that is the solution to the problem of single parent households.
Yeah, it's insane. Like, even when you see this happen to animals, I always think it's a little bit harsh. Like you're denying them their opportunity to be able to breed. But when you're doing that to a human being and you are saying that you are doing it as an act of love, like it's not. That's not how you're showing that you care about people, that you want to do what's best for humanity.
Like I just think to myself, sometimes we don't get the numbers because we're bombarded with so many numbers day in, day out. We forget 700,000. I can't even imagine that. You know, the only way I can imagine that is looking at Leicester, where we came from, which was like what, 250, almost 300,000 people in the city. It's more than twice as much as that. It's more than twice as much as the city of Leicester, of women who are in childbearing age, who have Black women who have been disallowed to have children. They have been forced to be sterilized.
And I think what's striking about this is that, you know, we talk about the Holocaust in particular. You know, there is still mutterings of the slave trade and the fact that it went on for 400 years. But it's things like this. We've sterilized 700,000 women. No one's talking about it.
Nobody. And what is the knock-on effect of that?
Where's the people going to be born?
Exactly. What's the knock-on effect of that? So we cannot say that racism doesn't play a part in that research. We can't say that that research isn't being supported by racist ideas and racist policies.
Yeah.
And what makes it even more so bittersweet is the fact that the actual reason why there was such a great increase in single-parent households has nothing to do with Black women emasculating Black men.
Yeah, on the contrary, it's the fact that actually, historically, Black women were having a lot more children, you know, earlier on in the 20th century than they are now.
Yeah.
And to go into a little bit more detail on this, you know, Professor Kendi's own mother could see that decline in her own family. So Ma's married paternal grandmother had 16 children in the 1910s and 1920s. Then his mother's mother had 6 children in the 1940s and 1950s. But then his own mother had only 2 children in the 1980s.
Yeah.
And did 2 of his 3 married sisters.
Yeah.
So you're noticing that as the generations go by, there's a dramatic reduction in the amount of children that are actually being conceived.
Exactly. So it's not about Black women having more children, Black single women having more children, but actually it's about the fact that Black married women are having less.
Yeah.
And that is what's changing the numbers in the research.
Yeah. And this is the problem. It's very easy to look at data and come to your own conclusions. You shouldn't be coming to your own conclusions, you should be drawing on actually the facts. Yeah,
this is it. This is it.
So moving on then to the next topic, which is Black feminism. So what was quite a striking point that was being raised that has, I wasn't so familiar with this particular view, but it's being said that Black women being seen as a slave of a slave. So if the Black man is a slave and then the woman is being submissive to him, she's therefore a slave of a slave.
Yeah.
And there's then been this view of the Black patriarchies. And so one thing that we were particularly challenged by is this view of Christian sexism versus egalitarianism and then complementarianism.
Yeah.
So as mentioned before, if you're not already familiar, you know, both Vanetta and I identify as Christians. So we do have views on Christian sexism. To us, I would say ultimately it's not about me being more important than Vanetta or Vanetta being less important than me. We're both children of God, as far as we're concerned.
We're both equal in value, and abilities, and all those things. And I think one of the things that came out was the fact that because obviously if you have read the book, you would have realized that Professor Kendi does a lot of this chronologically with his own personal story. And so his parents were obviously raised in kind of Black Christian liberation theology. That's something that they were really holding on to, but they were also very much more so raised in an era of Black patriarchies, where father figures are seen as the most important figure, where, you know, no one eats until dad comes home, dad gets the piece of meat, all of that kind of things. And he was mentioning the fact that actually their faith, the Christian example, was feeding the same kind of doctrine into this whole concept of the father being the patriarch. And this is where his term of Christian sexism came in. But one thing that we kind of wanted to point to the fact that actually that is not how the church, that's not the only way the church sees gender roles anymore, you know, and there's much more of a nuanced conversation of, you know, the church has also been definitely privy of and guilty for turning scripture around to support their racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic policies.
Yeah.
You know, that's something that has always that has been twisted by church leaders as well. But there are different strands of conversations, and so we just wanted to put that out for people to know that actually it's not just about patriarchy in the church. We also look at egalitarianism, which actually is the fulfillment of feminism, because we know feminism has to do with the equality of women, bringing equality to women, because that is not the case, and that hasn't been the case for centuries. But egalitarianism goes to the point that every gender is seen as equal.
Yeah.
And so feminism, I would say, is like I said, the route towards egalitarianism. And then there's also the view of complementarianism, which in short basically means that both genders are equal in value, but they do perform different roles within the relationship.
And I think it's probably closer to that, where I personally would see myself in the sense that, of course, Vanetta can hammer a nail, she can cook a plate of food, she can mow a lawn, she can work, she can change a nappy. I can do all of those things as well. But then what about our personal interests? What about our temperament? What about our skill level with any of those tasks? That should surely have some influence over what we choose to then do. And then the fact that we're doing it together because we're man and wife.
Yeah.
We are a married couple. We are living life together. And so, you know, one of us focuses on some tasks more so than the other.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that, you know, Vanetta can't do what I can do. It's just that there's some stuff that I do that I can do better than her. Just like there's stuff that she does that I can definitely do, but she can do it better than me. And, you know, there's times where even if it's a strength for one of us, the other one where it might be a weakness, we may actively do it so that we can develop it so it becomes a strength, you know? So I think it's actually recognizing, as not just Professor Kendi needing to highlight this, that we all have our unique way of offering something special to the world. We should be looking at how we can all work together rather than just seeing that one person is more important than another for any reason. And we'll talk about that a bit more as we go into chapter 15 after this one.
And so this Black feminism was kind of birthed out of all these movements of, you know, hold on, we're being seen even lesser than the slave. You know, in patriarchies, we're being told that the man is the most important. And then in our faith, we're being told the same. And it actually got to the point where, you know, Black women were kind of coming against the fact that and seeing that actually women are not incubators to grow the nation, the Black nation. They were moving away from Black women stereotypes of, you know, either being the Black bee or, you know, being the matriarch. It's like caricatures, there's no in between. But then at the same time, Professor Kendi challenges the readers to say, actually, either you're feminist or you're anti-feminist. There is no in between. The same way you can be racist or anti-racist, there is no in between. And I love the quote that he gives where he says, ideas often dance a cappella. And this is a point that he's making basically to say that if you have not intentionally taken the time to reflect on where you stand, you're probably the opposite of what you want to be. So he gives the example of he wasn't raised to not be homophobic. No one spoke in his family about homosexuality. No one spoke in his family about transgenderism. So for him, he automatically, unintentionally and intentionally became homophobic, or was homophobic in his thinking and acting, because he wasn't being intentional in actually being anti-homophobic and anti-transphobic. And the same way he wasn't being he was being anti-feminist rather than feminist. And then we come to the last point in this chapter about gender racism.
So this is the intersection of racism and sexism. So as I said before, it's not just that you're Black, it's not just that you're female, it's that you're a Black female, for example. So anti-racism and feminism do ultimately go hand in hand. Now, they go together because there's huge wealth disparities based on racialized genders. So for example, in the United States, the average income of a white woman would be $42,000 versus the average of a black woman, which is $100. Not 100,000. I didn't say any thousands for the black woman. I just said $100.
And these are single women, so it's not like they are in households where children, they pay bills. No, so the average single white woman in the US for the year earns $42,000, which is average. Obviously, it's less than the white male, which is a problem. But then when you look at the black woman, $100.
Yeah, and let's just think about what can lead to something like that. Is it that these black women aren't working?
Exactly.
And you would think, well, to some extent, if all they're earning is $100, because obviously they need to live on more than $100. There's rent, there's health insurance, there's groceries, there's utility bills. But if they're not paying for it because it's being paid for by benefits, and they on the average is that they're earning $100 for a year can't do anything meaningful.
Yeah.
Nothing really meaningful. What's that? 50 Happy Meals? That's what, a Happy Meal a week? And then you miss out for 2 weeks. Like what are you going to do with $100 for a whole year? You can't save that up and go anywhere with that, even on holiday. What are you going to do with that?
And the problem is that racists will look at this statistic and say, well, black women just don't work hard enough, or black women are just stupid, and it's like, no, sorry, that's too easy an answer. Yeah. You can't tell us that most black women in the US don't work enough or are stupid. Or like this, it makes no sense. It makes no sense.
Because even if it was flipped, where it was white women were actually on 100,000 and black women were on 42,000, that's still a huge disparity. But at least you're knowing that these black women are able to earn money. But it means that there's something happening to mean that these women are not earning money. Why?
Yeah.
It's not that there's no internet. It's not like they never had an opportunity to go to school, never had the opportunity of getting a job. But there must be something about that education, something about those jobs, about getting that education and getting those jobs that is inferior to what is happening to the white woman. You can't just blame the black woman for this happening to her.
Yeah.
So moving on then, there's this hierarchy. Do you want to talk about
this? So this was again relating to the fact that here is where we see gender racism at the intersection of racism and sexism. So intersectionality, a word that we hear often, use often, it really has to do with the coming together of different types of oppression. And this intersectionality is seen very clearly in the narrative that is spun, where you create a hierarchy from the hyper dangerous black man, who you need to be afraid of, who you need to be aware of, who needs to be policed, who needs to be kneed, who needs to be mass incarcerated, who needs to be lynched, to right down from the hyper dangerous black man to the white man, to the black woman, and then to the white woman. And so this is with relation to the perception of danger. So the black woman is never above the white woman unless it has to do about how dangerous we perceive her. So the white woman sits at the bottom of this hierarchy as the pinnacle of innocent frailty, as it's often called. And so I've put in here the Amy Cooper effect. And for those of you who don't know about Amy Cooper, she was the lady who, we might have not seen the video, but she called the cops on a black man, black bird watcher in Central Park, New York. I think this happened before George Floyd. Or literally the same week or something. Yeah, so she called the cops on a black bird watcher because the gentleman had asked her to put her dog on the leash, which is the law in the park in New York. So he'd kind of reminded her, please put your dog on the leash. She didn't like him telling her that, so she decided to call the police, and he recorded her on his phone. So on his phone, you can see her saying to him, I'm going to call the police. I'm going to tell them a black man is harassing me. And she starts the phone call. And so this is the whole concept of, the white woman, some white women, so again, we're not saying that this is all white women, but white women having been painted in this corner of the pinnacle of innocent frailty, so that when Amy Cooper calls the cops and says, a black man is harassing me in New York, in Central Park,
think that she is innocent and that she is a victim, and that the perpetrator, because they're black, must be criminal, must be doing something wrong.
And so there will be a rush from the justice system to come and protect Amy Cooper, who knows that this black man might walk away from this encounter might be dead after the encounter.
He's not walking away.
Exactly. He might not walk away. Exactly. She knows exactly what she's doing. And so I know there's been quite a bit of a fallout where she lost her job, and obviously everyone's using her name and all of that. And, you know, she's just talking about, you know, she not being racist or things like that. And it's
but you
like,
are being racist.
You're
consciously being racist. You're consciously being racist because you said to this black man that I'm going to tell the police that a black man is not just a man, not just a person. You specifically said there has to be a black man that's doing it because you know that that's going to trigger the right response in your favor. So she knows that she was doing something that's racist. Whether she's really properly, consciously understanding it is a whole other matter. To be honest, I don't really care. I think what she suffered is a result of her actions. You know, there's a consequence for everything at the end of the day.
Absolutely.
But as Professor Kendi puts in his book as well, you know, white women get away with murder and black men spend years in prisons for wrongful conviction. You know, there was a story highlighted, I forget the name of the woman, but it was a white woman who killed her child. She literally killed her own child. There was evidence to prove this, but she was still acquitted. Let's just really process this. She literally killed her child. Like, we're not talking about an accident. Even if, you know, you're saying that I'm really stressed out about being a parent, I can't handle having this child, therefore I'm just going to snuff the life out of them. That's still murder. I don't care whether it's premeditated or if it's stress or whatever the circumstances, you've taken the life of your own kin. This is a terrible thing. How can that go unpunished?
Completely. She walks away completely
unpunished. Like completely unpunished.
And we know the stories of so many black men that are wrongfully convicted. Even the exonerated five, you know, who were previously known as the Central Park Five. These were black boys who were wrongfully convicted and spent years in prison, years before their case was re-looked at and they were, you know, released and exonerated. So the final quote really in this chapter is one that we want to leave you with before we go to the next chapter, which is, when humanity becomes serious about the freedom of black women, humanity becomes serious about the freedom of humanity. Because again, because the black woman is seen as at the bottom of the racial hierarchy, if the black woman is considered as valuable enough to be freed, that's when we truly can say that we are freeing humanity. Yeah,
and this is part of the reason why we've seen a rise in Black Lives Matter movement. Because if you, like, people don't tend to do this. You go to a website, you go to the About page, you'll know exactly what Black Lives is actually all about. And historically, it was there in order to be a voice of black women, particularly black women who are homosexual or transgender. And this is, you know, really, really significant because if you can actually make lives better for them, you should theoretically make lives better for everybody else.
And this is what beautifully brings us to the next and final chapter for today, and that is chapter 15, Sexuality. And the final point is on queer racism.
So queer racism is defined as a powerful collection of racist policies that lead to inequity between race sexualities and are substantiated by racist ideas about race sexualities. So again, similar to gender racism, if you're talking about a racialized sex, so, you know, or sexuality rather, so you're not just gay, you're a black gay person, you know. So this is what is then causing even more issues for someone being gay, is because of the race that they have. So queer anti-racism is a powerful collection of anti-racist policies that lead to inequity between race sexualities and are substantiated by anti-racist ideas about race sexualities.
And we go straight into a part of the book where Professor Kendi talks about some of these racist ideas on sexuality. And it says, racist ideas suggesting black people are more hypersexual than white people, and homophobic ideas suggesting queer people are more hypersexual than heterosexuals intersect to produce the queer racism of the most hypersexual race sexuality, the Black queer. The imagined biological stamp, the abnormally prominent clitoris, which is particularly so in colored women. And so this is literally research that was done, and again, research, because clearly it's research that was...
Research in quote marks.
Exactly, very subjective, that tried to give a reason as to why people were saying that the Black queer is the most hypersexual, is the most not in control of their sexuality, is the most sexualized among the race sexualities, which is just utter nonsense.
There's no actual evidence to back this up, to the point where even Professor Kendi was referring to one of his own Black homosexual friends who he never really knew to be homosexual. So only when he was informed of this by one of his other friends that he then thought, well, he doesn't seem gay to me, because he doesn't seem to always be checking out men and having sex with men all the time, or if he is having sex, having unprotected sex. Like, actually, when you look at the risky behavior of Black men who are gay, it's actually a lot less risky than white men. Like, they're less likely to catch HIV, to have unprotected sex and the like, as Black men compared to white homosexual men. And so there's this view that's come from research, which is a whole lot of nonsense, quite frankly.
Yeah.
Whole lot of nonsense.
Absolutely. And so by queer racism, we're looking at the intersection. So again, the converging oppression of racism, homophobia, and transphobia. And that has true real life repercussions for people, where in this day and age, we're in 2020, the average life expectancy of a transgender woman of color. So this is a Black, there's someone who was born as a Black man and then transitioned
born as a Black boy,
but as a Black boy, and then transitioned to becoming a woman. So the average life expectancy of a transgender woman of color is 35 years. What?
Yeah, it's literally half the average life expectancy of most males in the so-called Western world. You know, and
that's ridiculous. That's absolutely ridiculous. Because again, how do you justify that statistic?
You can't.
You can't. But people, racist people and homophobic people and transphobic people will try and find a way to twist their ideas and to twist their policies to say, actually, it's their fault that their life expectancy is short. You know, it's because they're not adjusting properly or XYZ, rather than looking at what are the policies that are in place that are causing such a shocking life expectancy in a so-called first world country.
Yeah, because just looking at the way of modern science, even in areas where, you know, life expectancy is quite low because there's poor health and, you know, serious health inequalities, generally speaking, if you're dying at the age of 35, it's not really because of a lifelong chronic condition like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, or anything like that. It's more likely to be from suicide or murder, or perhaps some, you know, sort of accident, like road traffic accident, something like that. But I could definitely appreciate that for the transgender community, it's going to be because they're either committing suicide or being murdered. It's not because, oh, well, you've just become so sick just because you're transgender. No, it takes years to develop serious complications from a bad diet or from smoking and so on and so forth. Of course, you get complications in your 30s, but these people aren't dying in their 30s from that. You hear people still living with chronic lung disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease into their 60s from smoking historically for like 40 years, 50 years. So clearly, this is a group that's got very unique issues with health, which is not just down to a physiological response to their environment. Clearly, something terrible is happening to these people.
Exactly.
And we can't be ignoring it.
Exactly. And I know Professor Kendi mentioned statistics in the book as well about the poverty rate between Black, for example, Black homosexual couples versus white homosexual couples, and how, again, there's such a vast wealth disparity. And it all boils down to us challenging our own privilege and also challenging our prejudice. You know, from our perspective, we're both cisgender, heterosexual, you know, although we're Black, so that's already a category in which we might be seen as lower than others.
We're living in Europe.
Exactly, but we live in Europe, which also gives us privilege beyond other people. So again, this whole point of there's not just white privilege, that just seems to be the strongest privilege.
Yeah.
There are other types of privilege as well, and we need to really look at what are the things that we've grown up with, what are the ideas that we've grown up with, what are the realities and cultures that we've grown up with that have been trans or homophobic, that have been not giving those voices space. Because this is, again, it's the whole point of, you might not want to be transphobic, you might not want to be homophobic, but if these conversations are not had, if your ideas aren't questioned, then the default isn't towards being supportive of them necessarily.
Yeah.
Because it's looking at what are the realities that you are growing up around and encountering, and how do you respond to that?
Yeah. Yeah.
And ultimately, you cannot be anti-racist if you are homophobic and if you're transgender, because anti-racism ultimately has to do with equity in the races. And we know that gender and sexuality now also play a role in how we perceive the races.
Yeah.
This is why we cannot defend, and this is a quote from Professor Kendi, where he says he realized that, you know, he can't defend Black people if he doesn't defend queer Black people. And that's the same for all of us. We can't defend Black people if we don't defend queer Black people, because again, we are then creating inequity.
Yeah. And this is a challenge for a lot of people. You know, the fact that, you know, they thought, well, I just need to deal with my own life, me as a Black person. Because most Black people, I can admit that they would be heterosexual. You know, they're not necessarily transgender. The transgender community is a very small portion of the Black community. But we're all still part of the human race. Like, we've all got a struggle. Exactly. We're suffering here. When one of us is hurt, all of us are hurt. That's how we should be seeing this as. But some people are going to struggle. It's like, well, I don't identify as homosexual. I don't identify as someone who wants, you know, to change their gender identity from what they were assigned to from birth. But it doesn't mean that you can't accept that person for their differences. But that's hard. Like, particularly if, as mentioned before by Professor Kendi even himself, if you are not taught to be anti-homophobic, if you're not taught to be anti-transphobic, what actually are you going to then face in life for you then to be anti-homophobic, anti-transphobic?
Yeah.
Because let's be honest, all knowledge starts from home, ultimately. That's your first teachers or your parents or whoever else is raising
your primary caregivers,
your primary caregivers. That's where knowledge first begins. It gets augmented by the media, augmented by, you know, what you learn at school. But again, that's still heavily influenced by primary caregivers, giving you the opportunity to watch something in the media, giving you, you know, opportunity to go to school. This can all easily be taken away from you. So, you know, I think what I'm alluding to here is that we need to really be thinking, what are we learning at home? What are we teaching our children? What are we learning in our own private time when we're at home? You know, focus on how we can actually really think, what can we therefore do in order to be anti-racist? It's not just recognizing that, well, there's Black people and white people and all other colors people want to refer to. But it's more than that. Sexuality does have a huge role to play here. So does gender.
Absolutely.
You know, and even spaces, as we've heard.
Exactly.
Again.
And
so
there's a quote that I heard by Austin Channing Brown. She's a writer, activist, and she's written a book as well. But there's an interview that she did with Brene Brown on anti-racism, and I love the quote that she gives, because she says, really and truly, the work of anti-racism is becoming a better human being for other humans. And this just beautifully summarizes all the touch points in which we can be a better human being. We need to be better when it comes to space. We need to be how we perceive space and the racialization of space. We need to be better as to how we perceive gender and the racialization of gender. And we need to be better as to how we perceive sexuality and the racialization of sexuality.
And even previously with other chapters from the book, this also stems into, well, how dark are you? How light-skinned are you? How dark-skinned are you?
Exactly.
You know, your ethnicity, you know, how you define yourself ethnically as well. And, you know, what is it about your body that makes you be different to others? Just not what should be defining us. It's what should be bringing more beauty to the world. So yeah, wonderful quote.
Yeah.
So just to also keep you in mind that we've got a couple more episodes to go for the Anti-Racism Book Club, specifically for this book of How to Be an Anti-Racist. So we'll be looking at chapters 16 through to 18.
Yeah.
And then we'll have one last episode after that for this season, specifically just like as a roundup of the whole book, just looking at how this has affected us, our personal life, and also how we can provide more help to you if you want to go into this path of being an anti-racist even further beyond what Professor Kendi has said. So please check out this space for further information on that in future episodes. But to keep you prepared for the next season, we're going to be going into the book Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. Do you want to talk about it a bit for now?
So I'm really excited to tackle this. I know when we first started with How to Be an Anti-Racist, part of it was like, well, it's a very clear title. Let's start with this book. But one of the things that we've realized, obviously, it is very localized to America, which is not where we live. It's been a great pleasure learning about it, but we want to learn more about the European stats and the European perspective. And so Rennie Edo-Lodge is actually a British journalist. And we're really excited about just digging ourselves into this book and sharing it with you as you're excited and hopefully excited to share this book with us as well. So it's already become a Sunday Times bestseller. So she actually, I think, released the book in 2014.
Yeah, it's been
a while, but obviously people are talking more and more so about it again now, to the point that she's even updated it with more chapters. So feel free to order this book right now. We're going to be doing that as well. So there's not going to be hopefully too much of a delay for it to be posted, and we're excited to dig into it.
Yeah. So thanks again for tuning into this episode of Anti-Racism Book Club.
Yeah.
I'm really glad to actually have people join us to be receiving from this. If you've got any comments, any queries, please do reach out to us. Just drop us an email at info@thatmorrisonlife.com. Or if you're using the Anchor app, you can leave us a message there. But of course, if you have a recommendation for a book or you'd like to join us for a future episode to contribute, again, just reach out. We'll love you to join us, as we've had so far. We've had Ami Aminata Kamara. So she's a radio host for BBC, who's been contributing. And as well, who else has joined us?
Megan Wilson. Yeah. She is a dear friend and a photographer, South African, and she's given us some great perspectives from a South African perspective as well.
Yeah. So anybody else that, if you're listening to this now and you feel that you actually have something to say to contribute to the discussion, please do reach out. So yeah, thanks again for tuning in, and we look forward to serving you with the next episode real soon.
Take care.
Bye for now.
Bye.